Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today, we are going to talk about winter landscapes and urbanism. And here, we are discussing mainly about the subarctic and the arctic climates through my personal experiences living over there in the northern part of the Sweden and part of Finland and other places. So I'll be sharing my own experiences and how we tried to look into the winter urbanism. Before coming to winter urbanism, I would like to talk about notation. What is notation? How we notate places? If you look at this map of the ancient Rome, Nolly's map, which is a very famous, highly cited map, and this is where you can see the kind of figure ground map of, it's a well surveyed map, and it is it is showing the open spaces network and the building footprints and how their connectivity patterns and the whole layers of how each space is connected to what, So if you look at the Pantheon, and you see how the street networks are connecting, and then how it is connecting to various public spaces. So this is one of the basic understanding how Nolly have developed about and the ancient Rome, and how it has certain connectivity patterns and the hierarchy of spaces. Coming to the distinctive morphologies, you look at the cities like Barcelona, Copenhagen, and even the London, the New York, which is much more in the linear fashion. And if you look at the London, the old part of London, and you have the Rome again, and San Francisco, Toronto, each of these cities, they are distinctive by its compositions, they vary by their network, they vary by their scales, they vary by it all comes also through the kind of cultural roots, how they have evolved. Like if you look at the Roman civilization and how the scale and the dominance has been perceived, and if you look into the modern times of the Manhattan and the New York, you can see how the linear positions have started taking place. And like for instance, you see the Barcelona, you have a kind of much more of cultural network of how in the Mediterranean climates, how what kind of habitual practices do take place and how their markets are seen. And this is how the usage of spaces also differs from public to the private spaces, and you can see the kind of network, how it works. And similarly in the savannah, where you have the kind of the neighborhood park network of the green space network, how it connects throughout the whole city. And similarly in a Portland, it's again a kind of the sector-based network, and this is a much more recent developments within the Portland, especially where there are parts of it they have regenerated. And now, when we talk about these distinctive morphologies, when we talk about how one can understand a space or how one can show their attachment to the place and how it is legible to one's understanding. So I take back to Kevin Lin's, one of his important contribution of the image of the city. And he talks about how ethnocognitive mapping, the mental mapping procedures, you can see that how he started developing through the mental map approach, how we can take out the image of a place through our minds and our reading and our attachment, how through our habitual practices, how we can identify a place. So this is where Kevin Lynch have actually talked about 5 elements, mental maps, which is of paths, edges, districts, nodes, and the landmarks. Like for instance, I can show you how he talks about these 5 elements. One is the path, how the pedestrian paths and how the passages or the alleyways, how they're all connected. And similarly, how the edges have given certain meanings, and at the same time you have the junctions points of the nodes and the districts where the residential quarters and where people live around. So that is where you can see a landmark where, for instance, there's a kind of church or a tower or any particular built component which acted as a landmark. So this is how the Lynch maps of understanding the legible images of. And from following the Lynch, there has been an important contribution of how from the Gordon Cullen's work, which on the townscape, he talks about the serial vision. So in the serial vision, so it takes actually the journey of how one is moving around and how the movements opens up certain surprises and certain feelings. The moment you are walking down on a street and you look at it, sometimes the scale of a building, sometimes it's a kind of greenery, right? So these are all maps into your mind in a kind of series of visual landscapes, and then they're all embedded to identify a particular place. And it talks about some stories, it talks about certain journey through one's place. So events, it also talks about what time of this place is all about. And further down, we take it to Christopher Alexander's work, where he talks about pattern language. And if you look at the Christopher Alexander work, he actually develops 253 patterns. He talks about 253 patterns and how these alignments of within the city or has to be followed within terms of balance and harmony. And in fact, he talks about no pattern is an isolated entity, and each pattern can exist in the world only to the extent that it is supported by other patterns. So basically they are talking about how each pattern supports each other in order to have their kind of balance positions in their own way. And the larger patterns in which it is embedded, the patterns of the same size that surround it, and the smaller patterns which are embedded in it. So basically he talks about how a level of scale operates, and how the strong centers positions operates, and how certain boundaries, and also how he talks about the positive and the negative spaces. Imagine you got a blank wall throughout the edge, and how the people start using that blank wall, some certain negative spaces emerges. So how we can break those things and how we can create certain positive spaces. So all these patterns have evolved through the pattern language. And Matthew Karmana puts all together, and he talks about different dimensions of urban design. And mainly the first part, he talks about the morphological and the perceptual, social, visual, and the functional and temporal. So in fact, the context of urban design, he talks from a local to the global, the market and regulatory and the design process. So from here, we take it back because the urban design is also talk about, it actually departs from planning and it arrives to the juncture of architecture. That is where we talk about the building, how the role of fronts and backs can also place, and how the moment of public to private works out. So now coming to the Scandinavian countries, where we are talking about subarctic and the arctic climates, where I would like to show you this photograph. This is in Luleå on the harbor side, where I worked there for some time in Luleå University of Technology. And if you look at it, the same sea, and you can see the kind of pathways here, the pedestrian path people used to walk during the summer, and there's a housing location just adjacent to each other to the sea, and it is facing a nice view. So what happens to the sea from summer when it becomes winter? And this is how the same passage looks like. I've taken the photograph from the other side of the direction. So the sea gets frozen, and in the winter times, I'm talking about not a temperature of 3 degrees or 2 degrees. I'm talking about sometimes it goes even -20, -30, or even more. So during this time, what happens to the sea? It gets completely frozen. And that time, the sea was the barrier to cross to any island, but now it becomes a pathway. And how this pedestrian network, of course, the municipality is maintaining to clear the snow and every day. Imagine if this particular path is not cleared for a day or 2 days, then obviously it becomes a barrier. The path is going to be a barrier. Now, to talk about the context of Luleå, in fact, it's a very small town up north in Sweden, and in terms of wind directions, on one side you have the winds coming from the Russian side, which are much colder winds, and they follow during sometime in January or January to February, sometime in that, and they're very cold. And the other part of it actually comes from the south west side of it. And but if you look at the kind of snow cover, and almost 6 to 8 months the whole land is covered with snow. And if you look at the kind of snow periods, this is the Sweden map, and most of the time you see of this is where the Stockholm, and we are talking about a place of Luleå somewhere here, right? But this map which actually shows how, because the winds from the Gulf of Mexico travels far to here, and that's how it keeps a little warmer. And then, but if you go up north, it's much colder. So the moment we are getting more snow, you look at the kind of transition from a decadal transition. You can see some kind of prediction, 1961 to 1990. So the northern parts are still having much more snow periods, but gradually, if you look at the predictions from 2071, and it becomes lighter. So the things are changing, and because of the climate change and the weather conditions. So that is how it is changing. And in the previous slides, like you can see that how many days of snow you'll get per year, and you can see that most of the snows you are having almost 225 days, and whereas in the Luleå part of it you have about 175 days of snow per year. And similarly, we have the temperature as well, and this is how it's because in winter climates, what happens to the vegetation, what happens to the farming? So because they're all mostly shut down, and for almost 6 to 8 months, and nowadays, because of the temperature increase, so certain farming activities are all, the days of farming activities and the days of vegetation are also increasing. Like in summer, you see a landscape of much green, but in autumn, they have about 4 to 6 seasons, or sometimes some people call it also 8 seasons, but about 6 scales of seasons. And in autumn, almost it starts sowing, and in winter, it's almost white Christmas. But when we call about snow and ice conditions, the snow and ice conditions here, the snow is in a more of a powdery nature, and in the ice conditions, it gets much flattened. It turns into ice, which is more slippery. And if you look at, have you ever looked into the snow crystals, how they look like? They are very fine crystals. These are some of the photographs of the snow crystals, and flakes when it falls on you. So they're all basically the compounded form which you see, but if you zoom out, this is how they look like. And what you see on the right hand side is the sea, the Baltic Sea, where once there was a barrier. When it was the summertime, it was a barrier. But you can see I'm walking, and even we are driving on the sea. So driving and walking and cycling on the sea. So it becomes a road. So for the winter time, this whole system changes. The whole geography, the whole narration of those places will keep changing. And similarly, the snow started melting down after certain, before the summer arrives. And obviously, it has a different implications. Now you can see this is a photograph from a back out of my house, and where you see the Ronio River in the summertime, and you see the same river in the winter time. So this is how it changes. And sometimes people walk around like this, pass around. Sometimes this was my walking track, but then the walking track also changes in some periods. Now, sometimes it's a path and sometimes it's a barrier. Now I'll show you some of the important things of you have this is in the city center, where they have all the regulations of accessibility and many kind of guidelines to how to make a better places. But you see, the whole ramp is full of snow, and the old woman is using her kick sledge to pass by. And for almost 6 to 8 months, the children tot lot is completely unused. And you can see people falling down because of the snow and slippery surfaces. So that is how. And also, when you talk about this photograph, if you look at it, this will be the evening 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock, sometime like that. But then you see the night. The 6 months of the time you hardly see sun, and the next 6 months, probably 4 to 6 months, you hardly see the night. So that is how the extreme weather conditions, and because of the light, and there's also deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, and also people don't interact much because of certain natural features, and that is how causes many depressions also within the people and the societies. Now coming to the winter ideological town, I mean, in ideal towns of winter. So Ralph Elfsgren, he talks about, in fact, if you look at this town in the north part of Sweden, he designed is a kind of protective environment. He talks about how to protect from the environment, and they have these reindeers, and so how we can all live closely, and so that we can protect our end. It could be easy for maintenance, it could be keep a close network, and that is how it is. But then the positions on the winter landscapes have changed since the Norman Pressman from University of Waterloo, where he brings a dialogue of how we can welcome winter and how we can live with winter. So why we have to be protective from winter? How can we live with it? How can we cope up our adaptable mechanisms through our adaptable mechanisms, and how we can survive in winter with much more active and lively places? You can see that is where he talks about Winter Cities Association, and you can see how how the snow is recycled, and how they make these winter arts and make a public places, and people gather around, children play around. So certain activities, welcome certain activities, and this is where an art and even sculpture also helps in promoting the attractive winter places. Now, there are a few examples of how a barrier becomes a path when season changes, like you can see, and what are the various activities during the winter in order to welcome it. So how the municipalities have done, they started about the skiing, the country skiing, and the downhill skiing, and you can see that the sea is completely frozen, and the municipalities create a wide road network to go through the island, so one can drive over, one can ski, one can walk by, and also the snow scootering. But you can see this photograph of in the summertime this becomes a play area, and this becomes the front of a house, but in a winter time this becomes a back of a house. So basically they interchange the positions between the summer and the winter. And in the summertime you can see the whole landscape. Then again, it's a fantastic landscape of whole lush green trees and all the because of when it start melting down, the whole river turns into a blue water, very fresh water, and that is how the landscape. But how people have adopted different mechanisms. For instance, in Kiruna, how they can actually recycle the snow and how they can develop certain economies. Like for instance, you can see a hotel, an ice hotel, which is made out from the ice from the nearby rivers, and they construct an ice hotel, which becomes a tourist attraction, and that is how they generate the local economies. Even the nature also helps in building certain cultural economies. And like in the Finland, you can see that certain myths of Santa Claus in Rovaniemi also, they become like a kind of center point of tourist attractions, and people travel from all around the world to visit these places, especially during the winter time. Now, myself and one of my senior lecturer, David Chapman, who was working along with me, he was from UCL Bartlett, and he talked about, with his interactions, this is an eye-opener for all of us, how we can look at the winter cities, because most of the things are dated back to either Norman Pressman time or even much before that, but not much of work has been done into it. So that is where he started talking about the annotation exercise, and where he actually develops about these seasonal variations, how a primary route becomes a seasonal route, and how a public space and a private space, and how the views and the landmarks, how the barriers, and how it could be a mitigated barrier, how we can talk about not only the summer entrance, how we can talk about the winter entrance. And we did a kind of small exercise with our students, from master students, of about studying the Portian area, where the Luleå University of Technology's campus do exist here, and this is all the residential neighborhood of students and the faculty, and also some adjacent neighborhoods. So what we did was we actually asked them to map down the way they move around and how they keep changing, how the notion of these public spaces become the public to the private spaces, the back space becomes the front spaces, and how a barrier becomes a path. And in that direction, I think we also, and certain landmarks, sometimes this was a landmark, and in winter, this was a gathering space. Now you can see a seasonal gathering space, so obviously it is not regularly throughout the year, but during the winter, maybe people come and put some fire or some barbecue, something like that. And like that, this is actually one of our student, Emil Iverson, where he talks about how these barriers in the summertime, and how we can actually ski from his house somewhere 4 or 5 kilometers away on the sea, and he can directly come to the university. So how a river or a particular water body becomes a pathway. And similarly, certain gathering spaces or seasonal gathering spaces, and how the landmarks are, and you can see how these, and you can see here, this is again a seasonal winter gathering space. So this is how we started working on understanding these winter urban spaces. And first of all, this is a very starting point of, and I would say very less work has been done in the winter urbanism. And if one has to look into it, it is not just only how the European formulas can actually work better in winter. It takes a completely different stage. And I would appreciate and thank David Chapman, with whom I had a lot of interactions and work, and which has provided an eye-opener to look into the winter urbanism in a holistic way. Thank you very much.